of September 2008 brought the largest bankruptcies in world history, pushed over 30 million people into unemployment, and brought many countries to the edge of insolvency. Wall Street turned back the clock to 1929.
The tremendous crowds which you see gathered outside are due to the greatest crash in the history of New York Stock.
How did it all go so wrong? The key trigger of the 2008 financial meltdown was easy lending in the U.S. housing market. In an era of very low interest rates and reduced bank regulation, there was an astonishing building boom across the United States. In California, banks decided that virtually anyone could qualify for a home loan. Jim Kling has been a real estate agent in San Diego for over 20 years.
Really, in 2004 and 2005, if you could fog a mirror, you could get a loan. That's how bad it was. They didn't really know or care about the qualifications of the buyers.
And a payment on that.
And whether those people could make those payments or not apparently wasn't much of a concern.
Bills getting to be more than you can manage? Crossroads Mortgage has a whole range of solutions geared to people just like you.
So if you're thinking of buying a home or refinancing?
Even if your credit is less than perfect, AmeriQuest can help. Call 1-866...
Banks began making what were called subprime loans to people who could ill afford to pay back the money, especially if house prices ever went down. The one man who could have stopped that practice was then U.S. Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan. For 20 years, the world's most powerful banker. Greenspan was revered in Washington. His power feared even by presidents.
The Federal Reserve was the one agency that had the full authority to regulate subprime lending. And despite all the evidence, despite all the yellow and red lights going off, they chose not to.
We now know that banks and mortgage companies were indulging in all sorts of fraudulent practices to pump up their mortgage business. Many of the loans were extremely complex and the terms hidden from borrowers. There were low teaser rates that would automatically reset to much higher payments after a few months. It was no accident that the most complex mortgages were sold to the least sophisticated buyers, especially in poor and minority neighborhoods like this one in South Central Los Angeles. The wild atmosphere in Britain was brought about because Chancellor of the Exchequer Gordon Brown was easing financial regulation there. He called his new approach the light touch.
We will advance if there is light touch regulation, a competitive tax environment and flexibility.
Well, Gordon Brown light touch was an effort really to make the City of London the world's greatest financial centre. And it meant giving the financiers, giving the bankers a very free hand in the marketplace.
Paul Martin was Canada's finance minister in those years. He says deregulation came about because of a competition between New York and London to become the financial capital of the world.
The race to become #1 was very, very important. But how do you attract the financial industry? Well, the most logical way is what they call regulatory arbitrage, which simply says, let's gut the regulatory system, and therefore more people will come.
Our government is in knots over ways to lower the federal budget deficit. Well, what if we told you we found a pot of money, over $60 billion a year, that could be used to help out? That bundle is tax money not coming into the IRS from American corporations. One major way they avoid paying the tax man is by parking their profits overseas. They'll tell you they're forced to do that because a 35% corporate tax rate is high in relation to other countries. And indeed, it seems the tax code actually encourages companies to move businesses out of the country. Companies searching out tax havens is nothing new. In the 80s and 90s, there was an exodus to Bermuda and the Cayman Islands, where there were no taxes at all. When President Obama threatened to clamp down on tax dodging, many companies decided to leave the Caribbean. But instead of coming back home, they went to safer havens like Switzerland.
Now, all but 2 of the top 100 firms on the London Stock Exchange use tax havens, according to new research. These are household names like British Business BP, HSBC, Prudential, and British American Tobacco. The charity Action Aid says ministers can no longer afford to turn a blind eye to the use of such arrangements, which are, of course, perfectly legal. Its report says that 98 of the FTSE 100 companies use tax havens, having a total of 8,492 offshore subsidiaries. The advertising company WPP alone has 611 tax haven companies, and the big 4 British banks have 1,649 offshore subsidiaries between them. In a moment, we'll be debating whether the government should act. But first, our business correspondent Sarah Smith reports from one of the closest of the world's tax havens, the Channel Island of Jersey.
It is perfectly legal to come to an offshore tax haven like Jersey and register your company here to minimise your tax bill. The British government won't even try to discourage you. But when British companies do this, it costs the UK billions in lost tax revenue.
We've always known that Jersey's very low tax rates, 0% corporation tax, make it a very attractive place for companies to register. But until now, we had no idea just how many of Britain's biggest firms use tax havens. 98 out of the FTSE 100 companies admit that they have subsidiaries in tax havens like Jersey. Tax experts have told us they are shocked by this figure. The practice is far more widespread than they'd ever realised. They say that means they're going to have to revise up the estimates as to how much this costs the UK Treasury.
Previous best guesses put the losses to the Exchequer at £18 billion a year. Now we know it could be much, much more.
British taxpayers lose probably tens of billions of revenue every year as a result of tax avoidance through these offshore structures. And the effect of this is that as companies increasingly use offshore tax havens, now our corporate economy is increasingly dominated by those companies, governments are switching the tax charge away from companies and onto households.
Thousands of British companies have registered offices in Jersey.
At one single address in St Helier, at 22 Grenville Street over there, 27 FTSE 100 companies have subsidiaries listed. 3 of them use it as their registered company address. But there's no sign of any of their names outside. Let's see if we can find them inside.
I went looking for someone from WPP, a big British advertising firm who register their company address here. Yet no one seemed to have heard of them. After 20 minutes, a lawyer appeared.
At 22 Grenville Street, WPP are registered as having this as their company address, but there's nobody here that we can speak to from WPP. Experian? Do you have anybody from Experian here?
No.
Or Shire?
No.
No, because they're all FTSE 100 companies who use this as their registered address.
Yes. There are many, many companies in Jersey with registered addresses in Jersey. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah. Now, just because a company uses a registered address in Jersey does not mean that they're using it necessarily to try and avoid paying tax. But we can't find any trading or business activity going on here from any of the companies that are listed here.
WPP in London told us some of their overseas subsidiaries are involved in the tax planning process, but they say it's a tiny minority.
Sarah Smith from Channel 4 News here.
RBS, majority owned by you, the British taxpayer, has 30 subsidiary companies in Jersey alone, 238 in tax havens worldwide.
Why do you need 30 separate subsidiary companies all registered in Jersey?
They told me they do substantial business in the Channel Islands. and that they adhere to the spirit as well as the letter of the law when it comes to paying tax.
Big companies have big questions to answer about precisely why they need to have so many companies based in tax havens.
But tax havens are secretive places where you don't have to answer any questions. Jersey is the second most popular tax haven for UK companies. The Cayman Islands, also a British territory, comes first. In fact, 6 of the world's top 10 tax havens are controlled by the UK, something that never seems to have embarrassed the British government into doing anything about them.
By the end of this Parliament, the UK public will have seen cuts to some 119 various taxes. That all sounds great, but for a government that's promised to create a lower tax country, news that they've actually increased some 299 other taxes might be somewhat confusing. The Brits are soon going to see an extra levy on carbon dioxide emissions. That means energy bills are going to go up. They're also going to see an increase in air passenger duty, which means more expensive air travel. And then some of the recent changes to UK tax law are quite simply bizarre. HM Revenue and Customs recently increased VAT for hairdressers renting a chair in a salon. And then who can forget the recent hot-baked goods scandal when UK tax code stated that a pasty would only be taxed if it was sold at above ambient temperatures. Critics say the system is simply too chaotic.
Britain has one of the most complex tax codes out there. High taxes, they kill jobs, it increases prices and it lowers wages. So at a time when families are struggling with the rising cost of living, the idea that there have been so many tax increases will really make life difficult for them.
It's clear that the British government is in desperate need of cash to deal with the dismal public finances, which means that by trimming a little bit of tax here and adding more tax burden there, by 2015, the UK Treasury hopes to get an extra £84 billion in tax compared with the year before they came to power. But critics say that once again, it's the British public which ends up out of pocket.
Look at these people, wandering around with absolutely no idea what's about to happen.
Hello, my name's Luke Spanton. I'm a Senior Environmental Health Officer for the Private Housing Service at Bristol City Council. I've also been working on the No Use Empty West project, a project to bring empty properties back into use being run by the 4 West of England local authorities: Bristol City Council, North Somerset Council, Bath and North East Somerset Council and South Gloucestershire Council. If certain residential properties have been empty for over 2 years and we've made every effort to get the property back into use as a home, an application can be made to the Residential Property Tribunal for an Empty Dwelling Management Order. These are also called EDMOs or EDMOs. Empty Dwelling Management Orders, or EDMOs, allow us to take over the property, renovate it as necessary and let it for up to 7 years. The owner then receives the rent, minus any renovation costs. Again, like all our legal powers, they are a last resort, and we'd rather not use them if we can explore other avenues. It's very important to stress, empty dwelling management orders will not be used to take control of holiday homes, second homes, or the homes of the recently deceased.
In Britain, 1.7 million families are currently waiting for social housing. This comes against a background of spreading debt across the country and a huge number of homeowners having their houses repossessed. RT's Laura Smith reports from London on one of the biggest housing crises the country has ever faced.
It's the biggest social issue facing Britain today. There's a chronic housing shortage and an increasingly dilapidated housing stock that isn't being replaced. It's to do with the recession, but a crisis was looming even before that. House building has fallen by 70% over the last 50 years, while the population has grown by 20%. Enter the Prime Minister's pledge to unleash one of the biggest home building programmes this country has seen in a generation. But his opponents aren't convinced by those words, especially coming from a government that slashed £4 billion from investment in affordable housing shortly after its election.
Affordable housing building starts have collapsed by 68%. Council house building starts have collapsed by 97%. We've not seen a fall like this in our history, and it's the responsibility of that failed set of government policies.
And desperate times call for desperate measures. One council's reportedly considering asking people to rent out rooms in their houses to solve the shortage of accommodation. Meanwhile, more than half of social housing in some areas is under-occupied. In Hertfordshire, north of London, there are more than 3,000 families languishing on a housing list, while 5,700 homes are underused. And the problem isn't just with social housing. Decades of undersupply have seen house prices spiral out of reach. Banks won't lend to first-time buyers, and paying high levels of rent mean they're unable to save up for the huge deposit lenders now require. All that means the average age for buying your first home is approaching 40 years old, and many will never be able to afford their own home.
The Brits have got it coming. A raft of nips and tucks to tax and welfare that's going to see those with the least squeeze the most. So while the Treasury Chief admits millionaires are about to get an average tax cut of over £100,000 per year, from next April, it's the less fortunate who bear the brunt of dealing with the UK's £10 billion welfare bill. But the cuts will come in disguise. Take, for example, the new so-called bedroom tax. Tenants in council housing will get less in benefits if their state-funded accommodation is deemed too big for them. Some local authorities already say that that could push up to 4,000 people into homelessness.
The Chancellor has really made the main target of his austerity agenda the poorest families, and is cutting the support received both for the working poor through tax credits and so on, and also for those unable to work too.
The idea is that people will move to smaller houses, freeing up homes for larger families.
Another problem is that the smaller properties needed for this to work simply don't exist, or at least not in enough quantities so that everybody who needs to can move, and that leads to a situation whereby people can be locked into a home they can no longer afford.
Well, I think people will continue to break the law, actually. Squatting will be criminalised, victims will become criminals, and that is outrageous.
There are moral issues here, of course, very diverse, very complicated. We do know there's a lot of empty housing stock, but at the end of the day, the building's owned by someone else. It's wrong to occupy someone else's property.
Well, actually, there's already a law that deals with that. That's called interim possession. This is an abandoned building. This is one of many abandoned buildings in Birmingham, about 12,000, which have been abandoned for several years. And I don't see how that is a crime for people who could die on the street to then occupy a building for their own safety and actually help them rebuild their lives.
We've talked to the government about the proposals for this quite some time, and our fear is that actually the result of this will criminalise a lot of very vulnerable homeless people. And actually, what's the point?
This family in Stirling have had to completely change the way they shop and eat. Even though her husband works with 2 children in college, Jenny, who's disabled, struggles to feed her family. Rising food prices along with higher fuel and other costs means in this house the cupboards are often bare.
I was missing meals, yeah, I was eating porridge for like 2 or 3 days, nothing else but porridge, because buying for 3 is less than buying for 4, and I could quite manage on porridge. But it's meat, fruit and veg are the things that I think families are missing the most.
In the past year, the cost of meat has risen by more than 5%, fruit and veg by around the same. Bread has gone up by nearly 6% and fish by over 11%.
What exactly are you doing here now?
Well, I'm packing a 3-day supply of food for a young man who's been referred to the service. So I'm putting together some breakfast cereal, some UHT milk.
This is one of over 100 food banks across the UK run by the charity the Trussell Trust. It gets food donations from the public and distributes it to those going hungry through a voucher scheme. It says the need is now so great that it's opening a new food bank every week and believes 500,000 people will need its help soon.
We've seen a significant increase, 50% increase in the number of people coming through in the last few months to food banks right across the country. London, Wales, Inverness, Cornwall, it doesn't matter where you go. You find people who are struggling on low incomes who simply cannot make ends meet.
It's that slow, continuous rise in prices of basic foodstuffs that charities say will affect the worse off most, as they're more reliant on staples.
The difference, I think, for people on low incomes or fixed incomes is that extra a few pence on every item is the difference between a hot meal and no meal.
The welfare system is supposed to be a safety net, but on the evidence we've found, about half of all the hunger being officially dealt with is caused by people not falling through it, but being forced through it by the system itself. The real safety net is no churches and charity. And as benefits are cut and rules tightened, the food banks expect to be seeing a lot more people soon.
A dispute over aid to Europe's poorest citizens threatens to spark a major food crisis, France has warned. The EU programme currently provides handouts to at least 13 million poverty-hit Europeans at centres like this in Brussels. but that could be axed after a group of 6 countries, including Germany and Britain, threatened to pull the plug on a €500 million yearly scheme. Volunteers at charity Restos du Cœur say a cut to the funding would be devastating. If we don't have the basics such as flour, milk, pasta, it's going to be difficult. We're going to spend a lot of time and energy trying to find them. The kitchen at Restos du Cœur is able to serve up to 600 meals a day if needed. Daniel lived rough for 15 months now a volunteer. He admits they've already sometimes had to ration. In certain cases where there's even a small shortfall, we'll have to tell people, for example a large family, we're only able to give you a loaf of bread or 1 or 2 litres of milk. Set up in 1987, the aid scheme was originally designed to divert the bloc's huge food mountains. But with surpluses drying up, countries like the UK insist food welfare programmes should be the domain of national governments.
Social policy is a matter of competency for member states, and that's where we believe it should belong.
The EU's Polish presidency has said it will try to break the deadlock between food ministers next month. For now, things remain in limbo.
It is the largest number of Americans living in poverty since they began keeping track 50 years ago, an increase of 4 million in just 1 year.
People who used to be solidly middle class, who are now looking over that cliff into the abyss.
The government puts the poverty line at just under $22,000 a year for a family of 4. Today we learned that with the recession stealing jobs, the number of Americans without health insurance now has climbed to nearly 51 million, 4.4 million more in just a year. And today, the rescue mission in Los Angeles told us they're seeing it. Tents set up for families in the back of their chapel.
This is one of those tents, and inside one of these, up to 4 people in one family will sleep here at night.
The number of tents has multiplied from a half dozen a year ago to nearly 60 today. And something else in the report today, more than a third of those in poverty are children. We could not forget that video, the high schoolers in California, the faces behind this new report.
We're like 4 months behind rent. And just have my brothers, they might be homeless pretty soon.
We have followed Chris Schultz since that video. His father was out of work, his mother a teacher's assistant, barely making the rent. And their refrigerator?
It's pretty slim, right?
Yeah, we usually have butter, but we don't have butter this time, so. I eat lunch at school, and I guess that's another reason why I like going to school, because, I get food at school and stuff, so. What can you do, right?
Keeps you going.
Yeah, keeps me going. Wishing some refrigerator, No, that's empty right there.
There's nothing in the freezer.
Nothing in the freezer at all, nothing.
Today we learned his father is still looking for work. Chris is now in the Army, learning mechanical skills to bring home, and waiting his little brother.
And Diane, the experts I talked with today said, had unemployment benefits not been extended last year when they were putting these numbers together, we'd have to tack on another 3 million Americans to this number.
And the food banks, of course, are putting out pleas for help as well.
Olivier De Schutter, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, is here in the GMT studio. Welcome, Olivier. Explain to me what is going on here. Is there genuinely a food shortage, particularly a grain shortage, or is this more about profiteering?
There is no shortage.
Are you saying that there are people around the world who are manipulating the market for their own ends?
What is very clear is that since 2005, 2006, a large number of institutional investors, pension funds, hedge funds, have an increased interest in the markets of agricultural commodities and have basically disrupted the normal functioning of the market, in which the physical markets react to indications from the derivatives markets where futures are traded, and the operators today are following signals which are impossible to read because of the impact of these very large financial actors.
There are lots of things which lead to food shortages. Floods, fire, drought, civil unrest are all assumed to cause hunger and misery for the poorest in the world. What's less well known is the extent to which the actions of some of the world's richest money men compound problems which are already bad enough. This street is in one of London's richest areas, Mayfair. This anonymous building houses a hedge fund, which is an investment vehicle for millionaires. Here, the actions of just a few people had global implications. One day last year, the people who work in the hedge fund here had a brilliant idea. They bought 240,000 tonnes of cocoa on the London commodities market, 7% of the world's supply. Having cornered the market, they then simply stored all the cocoa in warehouses. The price of chocolate reached its highest level for more than 30 years. This is how prices of wheat and grain have risen so much. The hedge fund wouldn't talk to us, but a few are prepared to break the code of silence among traders. This man used to work in the City of London, but then appeared anonymously in newspaper columns, becoming famous by blowing the whistle on the behaviour of the financial markets.
To them, food is just an asset, just like an equity or a bond or anything else like that, or a currency, and they have no regard whatsoever that for other people it's whether they live or die. So it really, I'm afraid, is a ruthless place, and there is a general cynicism in the city and in finance generally.
Deregulation of the commodities markets has meant the same financial institutions which caused the financial crash now trade staple foods which keep much of the world from starvation, just like oil or gold. Whenever there's a crisis, like a flood or a drought, traders bet against the price of food going up or down. Critics say they systematically distort prices to make money.
In moral terms, I would describe their behaviour as completely immoral. Every economic decision does have a moral consequence, and the bankers' actions don't pay attention to what happens on the ground as food prices go up. Food is a fundamental human right. It's not a commodity to be bought and sold like any other.
It's an open question whether proposed banking reforms could stop commodity speculation from turning crises into potential disasters. But one thing is certain. In places like Tunisia or Algeria, hungry people cause civil unrest. And that in itself should be enough for Western governments to worry.
It's not just Egypt and Jordan. Yemen and Tunisia have also had mass protests. They're all autocratic, majority Muslim nations. But they're not all oil states, and Tunisia is mostly secular. So what else do these countries have in common? One thing is high food prices, a factor in how all the riots really started and how all of it started. And it's not a coincidence that all of them have high food prices right now. Food prices have skyrocketed around the world, and a big reason for that is Wall Street. It started in 1991 with surprise, surprise, Goldman Sachs. Before then, Wall Street speculators played only a minor role in food prices. The way it worked, food companies and their suppliers, America's farmers, wanted to keep their business stable, even if prices spiked for wheat, corn, or other agricultural commodities. So they'd hedge their bets, signing contracts, futures, to lock in prices for some point in the future. Speculators helped, putting enough money in the system to keep things liquid. After the Depression, FDR saw that speculators could drive up the price of wheat, corn, whatever, by betting on commodity futures, the way Wall Street later bet on dot-coms. Distorting food prices like that could destroy the very stability future contracts were created to provide. So FDR signed into law what are called position limits. Limits on how much of that total betting could be done by Wall Street. And what do you know? It worked. For decades, the price of wheat was driven by fundamentals, like the weather. And Wall Street couldn't stand it. In 1991, Goldman Sachs asked the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the CFTC, to give them a waiver on those position limits so they could bet as much as they wanted. A CFTC appointee for the first President Bush said sure. More than a dozen other firms followed suit. Goldman Sachs even created commodities indexes to simplify the betting and goose casual investors into the casino. Again, Wall Street followed suit. Remember the real estate bubble? Wall Street wanted to hedge all those bets it made on mortgages, so they ramped up their bets on commodities. And when Wall Street started losing money on subprimes, they betted on commodities instead. By 2008, Wall Street had 5 times more futures contracts in commodities than it did in 2002. Commodity indexes held about $13 billion in 2003. By 2008, it was over $250 billion. That's how we got the oil bubble. Add record high gas prices to the cost of shipping food, plus speculators looking for another bubble, and you get a food bubble. By 2008, the UN estimates speculators held 65% of corn futures contracts, 68% of soybean, 80% of wheat. By mid-2008, the IMF food price index jumped more than 80% in just a year and a half before. It was the first time in history the proportion of people going hungry worldwide went up. The number of chronically malnourished people rose by 75 million in 2007, 40 million in 2008. That's why Egypt had riots back in 2008. Along with 30 other countries, Italian moms marched against the price of pasta. Wall Street speculators admitted they were doing it. In 2006, Merrill Lynch said speculation accounted for 50% of the price of commodities. Half the price. In 2008, a Goldman Sachs research paper said, quote, without question, increased fund flow into commodities has boosted prices. 2009, even Republican Senator Tom Coburn admits the speculation, quote, helped to inflate futures prices and thereby disconnect futures from cash prices, impairing farmers and grain elevator operators' ability to hedge price risk. Got that? Even Coburn said there was so much Wall Street money distorting prices that farmers and other guys who actually need commodity futures couldn't use them to keep their companies stable anymore. We don't notice price hikes so much because most of our food prices come from marketing and packaging. But in the developing world, the price of food is everything. And what country imports more wheat than any other? Egypt, where the price of wheat rose 70% last year. Last summer, Goldman called a report on the role of speculation in food prices, quote, misleading, and blamed other factors. A lot of reports mention that Russia cut off its wheat supply last year. What they don't tell you is why, because futures traders asked them to.
Now, you may have heard about how the resulting price increase for corn will hit you if you drink soda or eat cereal, both made from corn. But you're being hit another way you may not know about. Most dairy and beef cattle eat corn feed, and rising prices has forced cattlemen to find alternatives. And that brings us to tonight's number, 50%. That's how much some ranchers are saving by feeding the cows corn alternatives. Now, some of these alternatives are things like cottonseed, rice, potatoes, and peanuts. But that's not all they're using. According to reports from across the country, ranchers have started feeding their cattle with junk food, French fries, chocolate bars, marshmallows, Fruit Loops, cookies, ice cream, and yes, even gummy worms or gummy snakes. I mean, cows probably, to them, this is probably a worm size. This is being used as feed for cattle. Now, cows have a multi-compartment stomach, so they can digest almost anything, and sweets are the perfect way to get them to eat starchy sugar that they usually get through corn. The problem is cows will eat anything. I mean, they'll eat cotton candy. So even worse than realizing you're eating beef full of cookies and gummy worms and snakes, most of the candy comes from companies at a discount because it is damaged and not fit for store shelves, i.e. they can't sell it to human beings. Apparently cows have not shown any health problems with the all candy diet as of yet, and nutritionists have said it's not dangerous for humans to consume candy-fed beef. But you know what? We don't think that adds up.
Is this a beef burger or could it be horse? It's a question that's worrying 5 supermarkets.
Anger in Britain and now outrage in France. The country's foreign minister going on television tonight to demand those responsible for the horse meat scandal be brought to justice. We need sanctions as well as an inquiry, said Laurent Fabius.
Non seulement il faut une enquête, mais il faut des sanctions. C'est abominable.
But here there was confusion as to whether the EU could simply ban meat products believed to be contaminated. No, they couldn't, said the Environment Secretary.
Well, we're simply not allowed to. This is a European competence, it's part of the single market, we're not allowed to. Should material evidence come forward that there is a threat to human health, I won't hesitate to take the appropriate action.
But MPs who've investigated the scandal believe a ban would be legal.
I believe it is open to the EU Commission under EU legislation and the EU Treaty to have a temporary suspension of imports of this processed meat and processed foods, frozen foods, until we know where the meat is coming from, exactly what it contains. I'm not suggesting there's a health risk at the present time, but we do know that the horses in question may have been treated by antibiotics for a horse infection that could be harmful.
It's now thought the horse meat came from slaughterhouses in Romania. The trail then leads to the south of France, where the meat was butchered at a processing plant in Castelnaudary. Now apparently labelled as beef, it was sent to Luxembourg, where it was made into convenience meals by a French-owned firm, and then exported to Britain.
When enough food is produced to feed the entire world, why is there so much waste and hunger? It sounds simple, but there's something fundamentally wrong when, according to the UN, nearly 1 billion people are undernourished. Millions of dollars worth of edible food gets thrown away every day in developed countries, ironically much of it imported from nations where there are starving masses. A movement has started in a number of Western cities to combat this inequity. Freegans organise group events foraging for food in the waste bins of supermarkets. These dumpster diving nights recover fresh or nearly fresh food that has been tossed out daily because consumers want their food to look right and supermarkets want to replenish their shelves with a constant stream of new stock delivered to them. On top of that, as much as 1/3 of the food produced in developing countries never even makes it from the farm to the marketplace. Poor shipping and storage infrastructure means that even when local harvests are plentiful, food often rots before it reaches hungry mouths.
Insufficient storage and poor quality distribution means that a lot of India's vegetables and food grain produce is wasted like this before it reaches the end consumer. Even the government has admitted to a shortage of space, but yet it remains a problem India faces year after year. Most food warehouses, known locally as godowns, are leased by the government from private companies, but there just aren't enough of them. A poor quality distribution system adds to the problem, and 1/3 of fresh crops are wasted every year.
Our inability to distribute this grain is one of the biggest policy failures, not just of this government, but of succeeding governments down the years. And it's almost genocidal in its negligence, because a country where so many people are dying of starvation and where almost half the children are malnourished, to have grains rotting in godowns is completely bizarre. It's just not acceptable.
Supermarkets gratuitously waste food, and there is food waste all the way up the supply chain in every rich country in Europe and North America. But what I really want to stress is that the solutions to this enormous problem are actually quite simple. We really can reduce our impact on deforestation, on soil erosion, water depletion, and on world hunger simply by wasting less food. It's not the only thing we need to do, but it's one of the big measures we can take, and it's one of the easiest.
The Chicago Board of Trade has tremendous power over commodity prices around the globe.
We set the price for the world right here in corn.
Matt Maloney of the trading firm R.J. O'Brien buys and sells corn.
We grow right here in Illinois, Iowa, Indiana, and Ohio, Minnesota. We're the biggest producers of corn anywhere in the world. Chicago's at the heart of a very rich growing area.
In fact, the U.S. Midwest is the world's breadbasket, producing almost 40% of the world's corn crop and about 70% of its corn exports. But exports are becoming less important to American farmers. There is a new growing market for corn in the United States: ethanol plants that convert the grain into fuel for cars. A boom powered by high oil prices and government subsidies, concern about global warming, and a growing American desire for energy independence from Middle Eastern oil. A goal President Bush set in his 2007 State of the Union address.
We must increase the supply of alternative fuels by setting a mandatory fuel standard to require 35 billion gallons of renewable and alternative fuels in 2017.
But fuel made from corn could create as many problems as it solves by putting unprecedented pressure on grain supplies.
If we were to try to produce 35 billion gallons of ethanol from grain, it would take virtually the entire grain crop to do that.
Lester Brown of the Earth Policy Institute in Washington, D.C., is world-renowned for his work on food supplies and creating environmentally sustainable economies.
There is an emerging competition between the 800 million people in the world who own automobiles and want to maintain their mobility, and the 2 billion poorest people in the world who are already spending half or more of their income on food or simply trying to survive.
Brown says that the diversion of corn to make ethanol could spark dramatic increases in food prices and world hunger.
We used to have a food economy and an energy economy, but now those two are beginning to overlap. And the world price of grain is moving up toward its oil equivalent value.
The impact is being felt by livestock producers who use corn as a feed grain.
For feed, the pigs are getting, it's a diet of mostly corn. It's about 80% corn.
Mark Ledger is active in an association of Iowa hog farmers who are alarmed by the sharp rise in the price of corn.
Corn prices have doubled over the last year. That's cost us probably an extra couple $100,000 a year in costs. It's cutting down our bottom line.
So you're concerned about the diversion of food for fuel?
Oh, it's a huge concern. It should be a huge concern of everybody's. Next year there'll be 3 billion bushels of corn used just for ethanol use in the United States. And several years ago there was virtually no corn used for ethanol. It drives up the cost of production, so it'll drive up the price of food.
If you open your refrigerator door, you see milk, eggs, cheese, chicken, pork, beef, yogurt, ice cream. These are all corn products. And when the price of corn goes up, it affects the price of every one of those products. We could see in this country a consumer rebellion against ethanol programs.
But Brown is most concerned about rising food prices and the potential for political instability in the developing world.
The countries affected most are those that have corn-based diets. And the one where we've seen this most dramatically is in Mexico, where there have been countless demonstrations. There are scores of countries that are very dependent on grain imports from the United States and are being very much affected by what's happening now. I mean, in effect, what we're seeing is the conversion of the world's breadbasket into the U.S. fuel tank.
If we think about GM, what we want to do is we have to test it to see that it's safe for human health. We have to test it so that we can make certain that there are not unexpected and unpleasant environmental impacts. But once we do that, I see absolutely no reason why one shouldn't use the technology, and you certainly should not forbid it.
Consumers in Britain may still lack the appetite for GM, but as the world's population rises, so does the pressure for innovation in the way we produce our daily bread.
Now, I think the really big challenge for us as farmers is to explain the challenges we face going forward, and then explain how some of this technology can help us in the future. There's no good us telling consumers, you must eat these products, but we have to be honest about the amount of GM product that's being already exported around the world and is actually going into UK diets already. But also I think we have to explain how it will help farming be more sustainable in the long term. You know, some of the prospects for having much less use of pesticides, the prospect for using less fertiliser, helping us use more min tillage in our cultivations. These should be really strong benefits we have to explain to consumers that will make food be more affordable in the long run, as well as looking after the environment.
Monsanto began by manufacturing insecticides and later went on to genetically engineer the plants themselves for greater resistance. This allowed the plants to better tolerate Monsanto's own crop sprays. Of primary importance was that everything could be patented.
Monsanto's biotech seeds are patented for many reasons, especially because of the enormous investments in the science required for their development. In order to ensure a clear understanding about this patented technology, farmers who choose to buy our seed products sign a stewardship agreement, and this promises they'll only plant it for one-time use.
Now we have two looks at a case argued before the Supreme Court today that could have wider implications in the world of patents and technology. In 1996, Monsanto came up with a formula to develop herbicide-resistant soybeans, able to survive being sprayed with the company's popular weed killer Roundup. The resulting Roundup-ready seeds, seen here in promotional videos, were more costly, but they would dramatically increase crop production.
What we've observed this year is outstanding yield potential.
But the seeds are patent protected, and Monsanto prohibits farmers from saving or reusing them. Instead, they must buy new seeds each year. In 1999, Indiana farmer Vernon Hugh Bowman bought genetically modified soybeans intended for animal feed from a small grain elevator. But instead of using them as feed, he replanted them. Monsanto sued, and the dispute has now made its way to the Supreme Court. Bowman, speaking to reporters on the steps of the court today, said he still believes he did nothing wrong.
I didn't look at it as a loophole because I'd always been able to go to the elevator and buy the seed. You follow me? So I just looked at it that when they dumped it in there, that they had abandoned their patent. If they want to protect their patent, then it looks to me like it would be required, they'd be required to have to separate it at the elevator and keep it separate.
Bowman also argues that Monsanto, an agribusiness giant, is trying to bully small farmers. But the company says it spent 13 years developing Roundup-ready seeds, and it must defend its patents. So far, Monsanto has won in lower courts, and the Obama administration filed a Supreme Court brief supporting the company.
Justice Kagan raised a concern, too. She said, well, you know, seeds drift, they scatter. So it could be that some of Monsanto's patented seeds could go onto the land of an unwitting farmer, and suddenly that unwitting farmer is a patent infringer.
Patenting is all about control, and Monsanto is all about control. You know, they're already the #1 seed company in the world, and they control those seeds through patents, through government monopolies, so they and only they can use those seeds. The common heritage of the world, the seeds of the world, are now owned primarily by one company that has them in monopoly.
Now to an environmental issue we've been covering here. It's as big and as urgent as any other. A story we've been talking about for a while. Something has been causing honeybees to disappear since about 2006. Beekeepers estimate their colonies are down 30%. Given all that bees do in the natural world, this could be catastrophic. Theories have centered on mites and viruses, but now there is a new problem that might be a clue in this mystery. Our report tonight from our Chief Environmental Affairs correspondent, Ann Thompson.
Near Elbow Lake, Minnesota, Steve Ellis tends his honeybees that help pollinate 1/3 of U.S. crops that end up on our dinner tables.
They're as fundamental to food production as is water or sunlight.
But honeybees are under attack, victims of colony collapse disorder where they disappear from hives. And now this.
Now, normally in the spring, do you see this many dead bodies?
Normally in the spring, we shouldn't see this kind of a mortality event occurring at the front door of a hive.
Some of the bees are clearly incapacitated or stunned.
These bees are not capable of flying.
5 miles away, farmer Jerry Liebel sees fewer bees around his cornfields.
If there was a dandelion or there was a bee on it, then they have definitely gone down in numbers around this area.
Now, peer-reviewed research from Purdue University suggests honeybees may be victims of neonicotinoids, widely used insecticides coated on a variety of crop seeds. When corn is planted by machines, talc that keeps seeds from sticking together mixes with the insecticide and is released into the air.
It's an environment that is hostile to a honeybee if it's in an area where a lot of annual crops are planted.
Krupke says there's enough toxic material on just one kernel of corn to kill tens of thousands of honeybees, and there are 30,000 kernels planted per acre.
But of the 200 million acres planted with coated seeds, the largest manufacturer of neonicotinoids says there is not enough toxins in the dust to cause widespread deaths or colony collapse disorder.
It doesn't cause colony collapse disorder. There's just not a link there. The evidence just isn't there suggesting that these products are causing widespread colony losses of honeybees.
Bayer Crop Science and Minnesota officials are looking into the deaths at Steve Ellis's hives. Along with other beekeepers, he's asked the EPA to investigate in an effort to keep alive these workers so crucial to our food supply.
At this time, no other FDA-approved drug for bees is available for beekeepers. In light of this, the FDA's approval of immediate dissemination of Remedy to beekeepers under INAD 11755 is of particular relevance and is indeed noteworthy. Remedy is probably the only honeybee product in the world that is being manufactured in good manufacturing practice compliant facilities that are equivalent to production standards of oral human medicine. Biologics awareness for the grim prospect of economically unsustainable beekeeping due to the multitudes of pathogens and parasitic pests leads to the utilization of this evidence-based approach for honeybee drug development. This will hopefully substitute the use of undesirable and untested chemicals that often cause more harm than good. Maintaining honey as a wholesome, natural and healthy product is our top priority.
Last year we spent a lot of money
try to get it under control and trying to control ragweed, trying to find the right chemical that would work. And, you know, that's a painful lesson to learn. You know, Roundup was supposed to be the cure-all, which it was till the boat we're sitting in now.
We warned the companies that there is going to be a problem down the road if we become a one chemistry based agriculture. Obviously, the nature finds the way to win. If you look down in here, you can see corn plants that are completely stunted and all this ragweed growing around it. So therefore, the ragweed is pretty much choking this poor corn here. And if you don't do anything for a few years, this whole field is going to be a monocultural stand of giant ragweed.
Do you help unload corn? My daughter, she's got asthma. So when that stuff's pollinating and when the pollen's really thick in there, it makes it hard for her to breathe outside. And when you live on a farm, you know, the kids play outside all the time.
For years, Dow research technicians have experimented with organic herbicides to control weeds.
If we now switch and continue using 2,4-D corn year after year, I guarantee you that in 5 years we're going to start seeing resistance.
Pretty soon, I think they're going to run out of things. And then we're going to really have a problem. I'm trying to get my neighbors and everybody to try to do different things besides using chemicals and stuff. And some of them are listening and some of them are not.
Yeah, there's a good chance guys go back to cultivating or even, God forbid it, walking beans, which I had to do as I was a kid and that sucked and I don't want to do that again.
They're going back hoeing, walking the field. It's like going back in time 50 years. So that's the key down the road. If we want to maintain a profitable, sustainable weed control and crop production system, we need to diversify our tools for weed control, period. It's not a rocket science.
Huddled on the side of a frozen Arctic mountain, the men and women who've built what's being called the world's doomsday vault herald its imminent opening. Surrounded by miles and miles of icy wilderness, the Svalbard Global Seed Vault has been built to withstand nearly every catastrophe. Its precious contents, millions of seeds which could prove indispensable to our survival.
The vault is secure against flooding. We're well above sea level if the ice on the poles should melt. It's safe against earthquakes. We're 130 meters inside the mountain, so we should be very safe against nuclear warfare and even asteroids.
More than 1 million seeds of nearly every crop variety from nearly every country in the world will soon be stored on these shelves. The permafrost transforms the mountain into a giant freezer, but the vault has also been cooled to a further -18 degrees Celsius, which could keep the seeds pristine for thousands of years.
Of course, this isn't the world's only seed bank. There are more than 1,000 others in different countries. The problem is, so many are vulnerable. The collections in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example, were destroyed in their respective wars, while poorer countries like Malawi stored their collections in an ordinary household freezer, vulnerable to electricity and funding cuts. This is a backup for the world.
For a month now, the seeds have been arriving here in Svalbard. While the vault is the property of the Norwegian government, the seeds belong to the country who supplied them. The samples are being stored in these aluminium envelopes. Each holds around 500 seeds. The project is the vision of Professor Cary Fowler. He's devoted his whole life to protecting the world's biodiversity.
If we can't somehow, as countries in the world, learn to cooperate and conserve the crop diversity that's a legacy of the last 10,000 years and which we need so much for the future, if we can't get it together to conserve that material and to make it available for plant breeders in the future, then we're really in a way doomed ourselves and we create our own doomsday.
With the world's population set to soar and climate change and water shortages threatening global agriculture, Svalbard's seed vault may well play a vital role in guarding Earth's food supply in the decades to come.
Are pigs an invention or the common property of all of us? Who owns the pig? Genes on pig DNA, decoded and described by the Monsanto Corporation of America. But these genes have always been there. Will we soon be forced to pay fees for nature's heritage?
It is a very, very big business plan, and it includes control of food. From the seed and the field to the fork.
The politically charged patent is soon to go into effect worldwide. Christoph Zimmer, a farmer from Swabia, sees his livelihood in jeopardy. Is he soon to be prohibited from breeding pigs because their genetic material belongs to a corporation? The scientists at Monsanto claim in their application that certain pig genes promise more rapid flesh growth. If the patent is granted, Monsanto could in future also demand license fees for the Betzelberger's animals if this gene is naturally found in them, and the farmers cannot prove that they didn't use Monsanto's patented breeding methods. The American Patent Office, USPTO. This is where Monsanto has submitted its pig patents for approval. The patent authorities are not yet prepared to issue a statement, but the decision on whether to grant the patent could set the precedent for how the other 159 countries where the patent application has been submitted will decide. The major question remains whether life forms should be subject to patents at all.
Patenting living organisms is settled case law here in the United States, and I do it for my clients every day.
This allows companies like Monsanto to take up a key position in supplying vital resources, involving the control and manufacture of food products. Now they are setting their sights on the pig, which hasn't even been genetically engineered yet.
It's a very broad patent that would grant, if it's accepted worldwide, would grant Monsanto control of a significant percentage of all the pigs in the world. And here's what's so critical. The patent isn't just for the pigs, it's for the pigs' offspring. So Mother Nature works for Monsanto's profit. Every time pigs naturally reproduce, that is a violation of the patent that you would have to pay Monsanto for.